Hello, BuffEnglish here, and the title to Chapter 4 says it all: painted faces and long hair. I like it when the titles of chapters tell us exactly what to pay attention to. But before we get to those details, Golding opens the chapter with descriptions associated with rhythm. He first points out that the days themselves, the swing from dawn till dusk, has a natural rhythm of its own, and that the boys, being good Northern European citizens, adopt their own corresponding rhythm of work, play, and food. We also get an overview of the littluns, the little ones of the island, going all the way down to 6 years old. Can you imagine a 6-year-old on this island? Their days are spent charmingly playing and eating, mostly in a world unto themselves. And for the most part, they're generally irrelevant to the lives of the biguns, like Ralph and Jack, and to the story as a whole. Their youth and complete innocence are on full display and serve as an appropriate counter to the older children who are on the verge of coming of age, though their description does reinforce the kind of rhythm of life that Golding is giving us a bird's eye view of. But it's an interaction with the little ones that the action of the chapter sinisterly begins. Roger and Maurice, two of the older boys, stumble onto the beach amidst a few of the little kids playing in the sand, and their actions concerning, to say the least. First, Roger barrels through the kids' sand castle and destroys some of their work, a rather mean thing to do to little kids. Maurice follows, laughing, and kicks sand in one of the children's eyes. They're like two big bullies, taking pleasure in causing pain to smaller, weaker kids. But when it comes to Maurice, he does still feel a bit of guilt at his behavior. In his other life, Maurice had received chastisement for filling a younger eye with sand. Now, though there was no parent to let fall a heavy hand, Maurice still felt the unease of wrongdoing. There is this growing sense among the boys that their life in England among the grown-ups is this other life, governed by civilized rules, but they begin to recognize that those rules are no longer enforced. This notion is further illustrated by the much more menacing Roger. First of all, just look at his description. He has a shock of black hair and darkened skin, ominously hovering low over his forehead, which seemed to suit his gloomy face and made what had seemed at first an unsociable remoteness into something more foreboding. After Maurice leaves, Roger remains and darkly broods at the littluns from the cover of shade in the trees. Roger is a creepy guy. He proceeds to watch the little one named Henry play for some time, just standing there staring at him. Then, giant nuts, apparently as big as rugby balls, fall next to Roger, and he looked from the nuts to Henry and back again. And we can see he is developing an awful idea. There's something patiently sinister about the twistedness emerging from within Roger. Roger then finds a few stones and begins to throw them at Henry, but thankfully he threw to miss. Much like Jack in Chapter 1 with his knife poised over the piglet, there was something about the situation that Roger couldn't quite bring himself actually to try to hit Henry with the stone. Golding explains, yet there was space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by civilization. Like the description of Maurice's remorse earlier, here we see too that civilized society still wields a waning influence over Roger's behavior. For now, anyways. At the beginning of Chapter 3, we first recognized through descriptions of Jack's appearance that the boy's connection to civilization and all it represents is still there but starting to diminish. They still have hair, but it's growing long. They still have clothes, but they're tattered. And like we saw with Maurice and Roger, they still have morals, but they're starting to question those boundaries. And now we return to the title of the chapter. Jack, who was seemingly watching Roger, suddenly appears and beckons Roger and a few others. We already know that Jack has been absolutely obsessed over hunting, and it's no surprise that his obsession has led to a new discovery. The hunters can paint their faces as camouflage for hunting. Jack immediately begins experimenting with how he looks, and we know that anytime physical looks, especially faces, start to change in literature, we need to pay attention. Well, Jack is in the process of changing his face by putting on this mask of just different clays. We even get phrases like, Jack planned his new face. And once it's painted, he sees his reflection in the water, and he looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but at an awesome stranger. The idea of a stranger points directly to the fact that Jack is becoming something else, and the physical addition of the mask makes this all the more possible. And if these hints aren't enough for readers to pick up on, Golding spells it out when he tells us the mask was a thing of its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. Just like Roger and Maurice were starting to discover that they could push the boundaries of traditional civilized restrictions, so too does this mask of clay paints seem to offer Jack the same permissions. The most dramatic moment of Chapter 4 arises after we leave Jack with his hunters and return to Ralph and Piggy on the beach. Ralph suddenly spots a ship's smokestack on the very edge of the horizon, and in a dizzying sprint, the boys make their way up the mountaintop only to discover that their signal fire, which should have been blazing, was out. And it was out because Jack and his hunters were off hunting instead of tending the fire. The boys realize with unspeakable anger and despair that they just missed their chance to get off the island because of others' incompetence. And right on cue, Jack and his hunters began marching their way up to the same mountainside, triumphantly carrying their first slaughtered pig and chanting a unique, startling song. Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood. Remember that these boys were choir boys, and we can imagine them singing hymns and striving to lead pious lives. But now their tune and their rituals have taken a dark turn. Now, the boys are obviously excited about their first kill. I mean, they've just done a really cool, challenging, gross thing. And Jack above us is elated that his initial compulsion to track down and kill is finally fulfilled. But with the context of their circumstances, their delight in blood makes them all the more overtly oblivious to the fact that they neglected their responsibility to tend to the fire and caused everyone to miss their chance to return home. The boys are still swooning over their memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they closed in on the struggling pig, knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will upon it, taken away its life like a long, satisfying drink. The hunters might, in a way, feel like they're becoming men, but this whole story's critique lies in the fact that mankind, including grown-ups, especially grown-ups, is seen as corrupted and savage. This is a story in part of the loss of innocence and entrance into the dark reality of what humanity really is, underneath the surface and sheen of so-called civilized life. And we have to remember that in literature, the opposite of innocence is not guilt, but it is experience and knowledge. And if you look at that quote again, that's exactly what is conferred upon Jack and the hunters through their first killing. But Ralph is quick to bring them back to reality and cuts off their chanting immediately, leading to an intense standoff between Jack and Ralph and heightening the degree of contrast we see between these two characters. Ralph delivers the fateful news that they missed a ship, and the gravity of this sinks in for everyone. And while some boys might begin to show remorse at their decision to hunt, Jack shows none, perhaps defensively avoiding an acknowledgement of a mistake, and rather doubles down on his decision, claiming that they needed everyone to hunt for the meat. In the tension of this moment, with blame and accusations, fault, homesickness, and bloody juvenile violence in the mix, Jack smacks Piggy's glasses and breaks one of the lenses. We haven't really addressed the growing cavalcade of symbolism in this story, but Piggy's glasses are often interpreted as the boys' intellectual connection to civilization and a connection to the more cultivated half of themselves. The glasses, after all, help to produce fire, and the signal fire is meant to bridge them back to their homes. But this rash breaking of Piggy's lenses represents the budding departure of priorities. The boys, in essence, are starting to break away from their intellect and noble civilized senses. Jack finally apologizes to Ralph, and we see that the entire group of older boys is now being pulled in two different directions, both by the gravity of Ralph's and Jack's characters, but also by what each boy seems to stand for. Ralph continually reminds the boys of their desire to return home, of the long-term commitment to cooperation and organization required to get there, while Jack's persona seems to speak to the boys' more immediate, savage desires that no longer have restraints imposed upon them from the adult world. Jack is the id to Ralph's superego. They eventually relight the fire, but their relationship is now depicted as, by the time the pile was built, they were on different sides of a high barrier. We then see another symbol take shape. We've already discussed how there is both a signal fire and a wildfire, but now in Chapter 4 we see a third kind of fire, the cooking fire. It shouldn't be lost on us that Piggy's glasses, or what remained of them, were used to light this fire, as though representing that the boy's intellect is now being used for a more tangible, self-indulgent purpose. And while they're cooking the meat, a new kind of dilemma presents itself. Should Ralph and the other boys who stand with him accept the cooked meat from Jack? In a way, it looks like anyone who eats it ultimately condones the behavior of the hunters who let the signal fire go out in the first place. But at the same time, it's meat! Every boy ends up eating, and Jack, standing triumphantly amidst the circle of wild boys, seems to be claiming his place as a sort of hero and provider among them. The chapter ends with the hunters offering a playful reenactment of the hunt, with Maurice standing in as the pig and the hunters pretending to beat him while returning to their ominous chant. This has a way of bringing the boys together in a sort of theatrical or ceremonial way. I mean, these young boys have just done a dangerous and violent thing, and they seem to find solace in the collective chanting that transcends their more cultivated sensibilities into something more raw and primal. Ralph, still seemingly disgusted with the whole behavior of the hunters, and perhaps at his own sharing of the meat, angrily flexes his position as chief by claiming that he will call a meeting, and he storms off down the mountainside. The tensions that we've witnessed developing in chapters 1 through 3 seem to emerge more consequently in chapter 4. A lack of regard for long-term foresight, commitment, and responsibility ultimately results in exactly what Ralph feared. The signal fire was neglected, and their chance to catch a ship home was missed. And why? All because the primal, violent short-sightedness of the hunters chose to prioritize the killing of a pig and eating meat over the nobler goal of returning home. This seems ludicrous to Ralph and Piggy, as it would to any reader, but at the same time there is something perhaps frighteningly recognizable in Jack and the hunter's decision pattern and in the unfortunate consequences that follow. As you can probably tell, these tensions are left unresolved at the end of chapter 4. So, it's onward down the mountain with Ralph and the rest of the boys to have another assembly meeting and see if they can't persuade themselves to act a little more grown up in chapter 5. Until then, see ya!